Hello and welcome to Moneylife. This is Sucheta Dalal. This week, I'm going to talk about what happened at the grandly named Startup Mahakumbh. What happened there was the Union Minister of Commerce and Industry, Piyush Goyal, was invited as chief guest, and he delivered yet another controversial speech, one that swiftly turned into a lightning rod for criticism. This was not his first public takedown of Indian business or entrepreneurship, but the backlash this time was particularly swift, sharp, and widespread. His comments on Indian startups being overly focused on food delivery, e commerce, and even vegan ventures rather than advanced technology like semiconductors and artificial intelligence raised eyebrows and hackles in equal measure. Equally, when juxtaposed against the harsh realities that Indian entrepreneurs face while navigating our policy and regulatory landscape, they were really furious, and with good reason. Minister's controversial remarks, in fact, are nothing new. In August 2021, he delivered yet another broadside against Indian corporate giants, including the Tata Group, where he accused them of putting their own profits above national interest and attempting to bypass local laws. That speech triggered such a backlash that the Confederation of Indian Industry, which had invited him, has pulled down the video links to the event that it had originally shared with journalists. This time, the fallout is equally significant. So on 4th April, the minister shared a slide titled India versus China. He said this was forwarded to him by someone, and it compared the focus of startups in these two countries. Now, let's not forget, we are not hyphenated. China is far ahead of India. But this slide was apparently good enough for him to launch into a tirade against Indian startups for, like I said earlier, prioritizing e-commerce over more serious technological pursuits like semiconductors and AI. Here's what he said, and I quote, "What should India do? Make ice cream or semiconductor chips?" Interestingly, this controversial line is missing from the Press Information Bureau release that's up on the ministry website. The minister's attack was perhaps the best thing that could have happened for Indian startups because it evoked such a sharp reaction and had the strongest pushback, that too coming from the larger pro BJP ecosystem. For instance, TV Mohandas Pai, former chief financial officer of Infosys, who's been a very, very vocal supporter of this government. He said the criticism was unfair. Others pointed to structural hurdles, which are so persistent that the startup ecosystem is constantly facing a series of issues, from red tape to corruption. And frankly, the startups are in a better space than regular entrepreneurs who face much worse, not even talking about tax authorities, regulatory opacity, changing rules, and what have you. All this comes at a time when the world is bracing itself for the long-term impact of trade wars unleashed by US President Donald Trump. Heads of other countries like Singapore are addressing their people, preparing them for tough times. And hopefully, India will respond, at least after this avalanche of criticism from genuine entrepreneurs, which is out there on social media. This government follows social media like no other government before it. And so it knows what people think. It knows what's happening to business and industry, and especially entrepreneurs and startups. And hopefully, some good sense will prevail. Now, let's start by examining who do you think sent Mr. Goyal the speech? We don't know. But we did a search and found one post on X by Satyamurthy Nageshwaran. This was on 31st March, and it has an image that has the exact elements and title referred to by the minister, which was framed as India versus China, the startup reality check. Now I'm showing you the image. Look at it. India, red, China, green, and all the points that the minister made. Food delivery apps versus EV and battery tech, fancy ice creams and cookies versus semiconductor and EI, instant grocery versus robotics and automation, betting and fantasy sports apps versus global logistics and trade, reels and influencer economy versus deep tech and infrastructure. Yes, disappointing. We all agree. But let's go to what the post was. Satyamurthy was not doing a critique or lambasting startups. He noted that India lags China by a decade in terms of economic development and innovation infrastructure. Correctly argues that India must first address foundational issues, capital access, talent development, and ecosystem support before changing these big tech dreams. The minister forgot all about that, blasted them on the deep tech dreams without addressing what he had to do as a minister, what his ministry had to do, what the government has to do. Coming back to what Satyamurthy said, and I'll quote, India is 10 years behind China in terms of economic development and entrepreneurship. We need to solve ecosystem problems first before we leap towards futuristic technologies. Why? Because of the decade-long gap in economic development and a weaker foundation for innovation. Now, let's compare with China. Again, what Satyamurthy says. He says China has leveraged merit-based systems, substantial capital, layered growth, all domestic, starting with hardware, then scaling to deep tech. What does India do? Struggles with limited local funding. In fact, let me quote. He says, China made merit-based appointments while India hires policymakers on the basis of nepotistic policies. He also says India has tremendous potential. India's potential is undeniable, but it must prioritize fixing structural issues before chasing the cutting edge. In effect, the buck stops with the government. Meanwhile, the startup ecosystem has managed to do what the government couldn't, provide jobs to millions of unemployed youth, but we'll come to that later. Now let's look at another ex-post, same date, 31st March, by Sachin Sharma. He also compared India and China. He highlighted China's systemic advantages, talked about a more established ecosystem, government-backed domestic venture capital providing greater stability, deeper domestic footprint, and layered support for innovation, and a larger global footprint that China already has. In contrast, India's startup energy flows largely from private capital, usually international capital. A little more domestic now. While India enjoys a more open regulatory environment, with platforms like Startup India and Digital India providing some support, China's more closed approach often ends up with all kinds of things, including a takedown of large players like Alibaba, but it also provides a protective shield for domestic players. Consequently, India's top sector in the startup world was e-commerce, while for China, it was artificial intelligence. Notice that here's a chart. India-China startup ecosystem. He's talking about the number of startups, number of unicorns, the funding, and like I said, the top sector. China, as you can see, is way ahead of India. Now, both comparisons are very thoughtful. Nobody's blasting e-commerce. Nobody's criticizing them for delivery apps and ice creams, but they are telling the government to wake up. And since it was on 31st March, they probably hoped the minister would read their main points and not something else. So this was before the Startup Mahakumbh. They probably wanted him to take their feedback about the right ecosystem, genuine ease of doing business, predictable policies, everything that a business needs if it wants to focus its energies on deep technological innovation. Mr. Goyal missed the point entirely. Instead, his speech exposed a deep disconnect between the government's flimsy understanding and its adversarial attitude as against the lived experience of Indian entrepreneurs. But this time they made their voice heard. Thanks to social media, reactions were fast and furious, starting with Adit Palicha, CEO of Zepto, who was quick to point out that consumer startups like his had created 150,000 jobs, paid over 1,000 crores in taxes, and attracted over 1 billion in foreign direct investment without the benefit of the kind of deep tech ecosystem that China enjoys. They may not be cutting-edge jobs, but they provide steady incomes, they uplift family economies, and this is no small feat for a country that's grappling with unemployment. Look at what would have happened to consumer spending if these people weren't earning. Others chimed in to describe the hostile environment. Chartered accountant Nikhil Wadia, another big supporter of this government, He noted that approvals still require red tape and bribes. Mohandas Pai again, even more direct, and we're showing you his tweet. He's asking Mr. Goyal what Mr. Goyal himself has done to support deep tech innovation. He listed structural challenges, angel tax, which said harassed entrepreneurs, restrictions on institutional investment, and he says the RBI's harsh treatment of foreign investors and alternative investment funds. And of course, he has things to say about the unfriendly stance of the finance ministry, tagging the ministry as well as the minister. Take a look at his tweet. But perhaps the most compelling rebuttal came from Murtaza Amin. He's a semiconductor startup founder in Burhanpur, Madhya Pradesh. He posted an open letter on Reddit, which started like this: Piyush, I heard that you ranted that no one is doing semiconductors. Well, I am. And now, hear my rant. He went on to reveal how his application had languished with Mr. Goyal's ministry for 2 years before it was returned with a note asking for additional documents. Typically, within hours of the rejection, a facilitator calls and offers guaranteed results if you use their services to prepare documents. If you're Indian, you know what that means. Use their services and pay their costs. Thanks to Indian tax laws, he says he pays 2x the amount that his competitors do. But we have to compete, hands tied behind our backs. So he says he pays 2x the amount compared to my competitors outside India for importing computer resources. In addition to corruption, frequent power cuts, harassment by officials, and the constant threat of fear of potential harassment, even for speaking up. This is not an isolated story. Corruption and harassment by government agencies is among the biggest problems faced by Indian entrepreneurs, and this has only increased over the last decade. For all the talk of a startup ecosystem, entrepreneurs say they survive despite the government, not because of it. Look at some numbers. The Indian Business Corruption Survey of 2024 found that 66% of business admitted to paying bribes. They have no choice. 54% reported coercion for approvals and licenses. The Inspector Raj in India thrives. Everybody who has run any business knows this. This is in addition to endless harassment over ever-changing compliances imposed by a multitude of regulatory agencies. Now, what was the government's response to all this? Good news, it responded. So, it looks at social media. Faced with this deluge of criticism, Mr. Goyal announced a nationwide helpline for startups to report red tape, pitch policy tweaks, raise concerns about regulatory blind spots. Sounds wonderful, right? Very receptive. We welcome this in theory, but the promise has to be tested because we know what happens. India's experience with feedback and pitching concerns through formal, apolitical, and even not-for-profit bodies has been extremely disheartening. Ask us. We run Moneylife Foundation. Government departments, ministries, regulators do not even acknowledge studies, reports, appeals, notes sent to them. If you want to know what has happened, whether it's gone into the dustbin or anyone's read it, you have to file a right to information application to track the action, if any, which means you have to send it by post so that it's inwarded. This too is losing its impact because the RTI Act itself is being systematically diluted. Now, if Mr. Goyal's intent was to spark introspection, perhaps it worked, but not in the way he planned. His remarks may have reignited an important debate about what truly ails India's startup ecosystem or India's enterprise system. And the answer clearly lies not in the ambitions of young entrepreneurs, not in whipping them and complaining about what they do, but in the apathy, inefficiency, and often hostility of those in power. When will that change? When that changes, when corruption declines, when we focus on efficiency, that is when India will change, and that is when we can even dream of a Viksit Bharat. If you agree, please share this, because this is not over. It is going to continue. It is over when you see real change. Thank you.